What really piqued my interest to look at the stats for this topic was when I found an article stating that over 25% of Americans cannot cover a $400 emergency. Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. And if this is your first time, you're welcome. This is Essential Patience and I Am Patience. This is going to be the first of a new series I'm calling Stats Digest. We are going to take a statistic and we're going to go deeper into it and find out the truth. I didn't want to go too far from my usual content, so my first one is about the emergency fund. Is that we're going to take the subject of an emergency fund and we're going to deep dive into it. We're going to see what is an emergency fund, what are the stats around it, and how you compare in general. And at the very end, I'm going to share my thoughts and opinions. But throughout the entire first portion of the video, I'm going to share statistics that are backed. I'm also going to link my sources in the description if you want to read them and get to know more about the topic. I'm very excited about deep diving into topics because I am such a nerd for statistics and I'm very particular about them too. I like to know the truth. We're going to go straight to the sources. We're going to look at the data and to make sure that this video, as the time of filming, is as up to date as possible. So here we go. Episode 1, Emergency Fund. So this video is going to be broken down into 4 main topics, starting with the first one, which is what is an emergency fund? And I'm taking this definition from credible sources. We'll be taking our first definition from Vanguard, which describes an emergency fund as a stash of money set aside to cover financial surprises life throws at you. These unexpected events can be stressful and costly. And I think this is quite a good scope of what an emergency fund is. They also go further to list some of the emergencies people face, such as job loss, home repairs, auto repairs, unexpected travels, and medical emergencies. We'll be taking our second definition from the Customer Protection Bureau, which describes an emergency fund as a cash reserve that's specifically set aside for unplanned expenses or financial emergencies. Some common examples include car repairs, home repairs, medical bills, as well as loss of income. Again, similar to that of Vanguard. Reading deeper into these articles, a big emphasis was on not going into debt, credit card debt to be specific, or even having to go into personal loan debt in times where unexpected emergencies come along. So it is money that is specifically set aside just for what we would consider emergencies. And the emphasis is always on something big, something uncontrollable. So buying a new phone is not considered an emergency, or getting a new computer if it's just because you want a new one. But let's say you run a business and your entire computer system did shut off. Now that would be considered an emergency. But wanting a new phone just because, or wanting a new computer because you want to upgrade, is not considered an emergency, and therefore it's not an expense that is put into an emergency fund. Investopedia really explains it well when they state that you establish an emergency fund when you put away money that is intended to be used during times of financial hardships. This includes loss of job, a debilitating illness, a major repair on your home or car, and economic crisis such as the 2020 pandemic, which had a lot of people losing their jobs, losing out on opportunities, and really having to dig into their emergency fund when unexpected things came along. Now that we know what an emergency fund is, we're going to move to the second part, which is what does the stats say on emergencies? But these are some really updated numbers, and I think we're all going to be surprised what research says about people having emergency funds and maintaining an emergency fund. What really piqued my interest to look at the stats for this topic was when I found an article stating that over 25% of Americans cannot cover a $400 emergency. That is very concerning in my opinion. This was a 2020 survey. So now I want to take a look at where we are now. Like, we're in a recession, things are more expensive, inflation is very high, but what do the stats say now? I want to know how people are responding to it, and are people being more cautious in keeping an emergency fund for unexpected times. According to Bankrate.com, as of 2022, only 53% of Americans have more savings for an emergency than they do of credit card debt. This means that the remaining 47% may have some savings, but they most likely have more credit card debt. And that begs the question, if they do pay off all their debt, would they have any savings left at the moment? And that answer is probably no. But this is a noticeable decrease from 54%, which was what was taken in 2021, and just 49% in 2020, meaning that a lot of people are keeping more cash on hand and have more savings than they do of debt, which is a good sign. What is not a good sign is that while 15% of households did not have credit card debt, they also had no savings, which is not a great place to be. This also suggests that in case of an emergency, they're more likely to slip into debt, if not credit card debt, then personal loan debt or some other forms of debt. Generationally speaking, it was also found that millennials are the most likely to have more credit card debt than savings. And here is how they compare to other generations. While 32% of millennials have more credit card debt than savings, only 24% of Gen Xers fall into the same category, and 23% for Gen Zers, which is a good sign considering we are the youngest generation, and only 15% for baby boomers. This is an even better news since baby boomers are in the age of retirement or getting close to the age of retirement. So it is best if they have no debt and they have some retirement savings to ensure that retirement comes for them, and it's a much easier stage of life. Another interesting find was that when asked, how are you prioritizing paying off debt and boosting up your emergency fund, 50% of Americans pointed to boosting emergency funds, 32% are paying down debt, and only 4% were focusing on both at the same time. But a concerning 1 in 8 household, which is 12%, said that neither was a priority. In this time of recession and inflation, a lot of people are keeping more cash on hand, not knowing what the world is going to be looking like in a few months and even years. And going back to the stats that piqued my interest of over 25% of Americans not being able to cover a $400 emergency bill, this means that 75% approximately could. But a 2022 survey by Bankrate.com showed that 56% of Americans could not cover a $1,000 emergency. This is concerning, meaning that less than 50% of American households can cover a $1,000 emergency. In fact, only 44% can, and this is the highest it's been in the past 8 years. And I think that we can dictate some of the increase in numbers to the pandemic and how such an unexpected event can really allow people to think and to save up more money and to prioritize having an emergency fund, no matter how little. When asked how they will cover a $1,000 emergency, we can point to this chart, which 44% said they could pay from their savings, which is reflected in the number that we stated, and 20% said that they would charge it on a credit card and pay over time, which means credit card debt and paying interest on that debt. Another 15% say that they will pay the bill and cut other expenses, which points to that if you are able to cut other expenses, you could save for an emergency fund so that you wouldn't have to cut expenses at the time where you need the money, but you can gradually cut expenses and save up for the emergency. 10% said they will borrow from their friends and family, which is good on them, but it's not always guaranteed. And 4% said they would take a personal loan, which shows that they would also have to pay interest on that money. An interesting analysis that you can take is that nearly 60% of college graduates could cover a $1,000 emergency, as well as people who make over $50,000 a year in annual income. Now that we're done with that part, let's move into, do you need an emergency fund? This is a discussion that can go either way. I'm saving my opinions for the end, so let's go to what the experts and researchers say. Research suggests that individuals who struggle to recover from a financial shock have less savings to protect them from a future emergency. They may also rely on credit cards and loans, which can lead to debt that's gradually harder to pay off. They may also pull from other savings like retirement funds to cover these expenses. And remember that when you pull from your retirement funds, it comes with a penalty, especially if it is a traditional IRA or 401k. They found that people who have emergency funds are less stressed. And as I've heard the saying, a lot of time when you have an emergency fund, it turns an emergency into an inconvenience, which is true for a lot of things. It also keeps you from spending money that you would otherwise have to use for other things. When an emergency comes along, you wouldn't have to cut all your other expenses and try to find a way to pay for this emergency. You have money designated to pay for that, or at least to help lessen that financial burden. It also keeps you from making bad and rushed financial decisions, as well as it being the backbone to your financial future and financial freedom. I've never really heard anybody discourage people from having an emergency fund. Maybe there are people like that. Most financial experts would encourage you and say that an emergency fund is a must if you want to build a strong financial future. But now that we know that, how much do you need? That's always the big question. How much do you need? Is $1,000 enough? Do you need $10,000? $50,000? What does the research say? So I'm going to go to what the experts say, and we can all learn something from them. According to NetWallet, if you're just starting an emergency fund, you want to keep a minimum $500 and build up to a half a year's worth of expenses. What is considered half a year's worth of expenses? Well, you're going to take everything from your housing to your utilities, cost of transportation, car insurance, car notes, all of your expenses, and you're going to multiply that by 6. So 1 month expenses times 6, and that's how much you want to save. So if your monthly expenses is up to $2,000, a 6 months worth of emergency fund will be $12,000, and that's what you want to aim towards. So you start and then you build it up over time. Many financial experts say that it's based on your current financial standing, but always encourage that you save between 3 to 6 months worth of expenses. And always remember that as your financial standing changes and your lifestyle for a living, you also change your emergency fund. So if you used to live on $2,000 a month and now you're living on $3,000 a month, make sure that you save up an extra $6,000 now that your expenses have increased. Since we are by nature creatures of comparison, here are some numbers you can compare yourself to, not in a bad way, just to see where you stand with your peers, people older than you, younger than you, and where you want to fit in. So here are some numbers to point to where other people are. According to Money Under 30, only 23% of Americans have an emergency fund that covers up to 6 months of the expenses. The most concerning thing they found was that 26% of people had no emergency fund. 32% of people had some, but definitely less than the recommended minimum 3 months of the expenses. And 22% of people had between 3 months and 5 months of expenses, which is not bad at all. For the age group that's most likely to have an emergency fund or sufficient emergency fund, they found that 18 to 30-year-olds were the most likely to have up to 5 months emergency. And they chalk this up to it being possibly having lower expenses. A lot of people within that age group, they don't have that much to sustain a house and having a ton of other expenses. So it's much easier for them to reach their goal of an emergency fund. When comparing the education of people with and without emergency funds, it was discovered that 36% of people with a high school diploma as their highest form of education had no emergency funds. This is compared to 10% of people with a college degree who had no emergency fund. This means that 64% of people with a high school degree as their highest had some form of emergency fund, and 90% of people with college degrees as their highest form of education had an emergency fund of some sort. This can be explained in multiple ways. On average, people with college degrees have better paying jobs and have a more sustainable field of career compared to people who do not have a college degree. But just because somebody is making a lot of money does not mean they are saving it. In fact, only 46% of people who are making over $75,000 or more have a 6 months emergency fund. Now that we are done with the stats and everything, let's get into my thoughts and opinions. I think that an emergency fund is a must. You can put it in a high interest savings account and stash up to 6 months of emergency fund. You never know what the future holds, so you always want to make sure that you're putting yourself in the best financial position possible. Even if you're paying off debt, at least have $1,000 aside just in case anything happens, and then focus on paying off all your debt. And once you're done with paying everything off, you can come back and really build that emergency fund. If you have a family, children, you may want to have a little bit more money, maybe $2,000, but you also want to make sure they're focusing on paying off all your debt so you can come back and build on your emergency fund without having a lot of debt with you. I also believe that emergency fund should be kept just for emergencies. If there's something that you don't need immediately, or it's not in need of immediate attention that you can save up towards, do that. Do not keep dipping into your emergency funds because you want to buy something new. And if you do dip into it for something of an emergency, make sure you replenish it. The emergency fund is not going to replenish itself. Assess your lifestyle. Does it change? And if you need more emergency fund because your lifestyle has changed and now you have more expenses, make sure to account for that as well. And that brings an end to my thoughts and opinions on this. I'm actually really glad I did this research. It was very interesting. But before we leave, one place that I wanted to also do research on is Urban Dictionary, because if you don't know, that's like the pinnacle of English literature. So I wanted to see, what does Urban Dictionary define as an emergency fund? Unfortunately, I couldn't find an emergency fund, but I found something even better. I found the definition for a slush fund, which I'm guessing is related to an emergency fund. So here is the definition. Slush fund, a sum of money set apart for discretionary and or undocumented spending, often fraudulent, illegal, or dishonest. News junkie. Our government is widely known for unaccountable slush funds built up to funnel money to their friends. Innocent kid. Are you serious? I've never heard about that. How could that ever happen? And with that, I would like to say thank you all for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know in the comment section what you think about this video. I really appreciate you watching. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.